Program Chair, fellow Vice-Chancellors, Beryl, friends, colleagues. Since we are in South Africa, I must greet you as comrades. Welcome let me kick off by actually thanking the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts on the deliberations at hand. It's really a great pleasure to be here. And I want to also welcome you to South Africa and this beautiful part of the country. I'm going to refrain from encouraging you to do tourism. It did sound like my fellow vice-chancellors were getting a subsidy from the tourism agency. But it is a beautiful part of the country, and Max is right. It's an incredibly beautiful time to be in this part of the country. I want to also say that actually, for Talloires Network to have its first conference in South Africa is really it's a fantastic opportunity. And it's really there can't be a more appropriate place to have your first conference, because I don't think there's many places in the world where universities have had such a direct impact on their societies. What is quite striking is this is a place where universities were at the forefront, sometimes directly in their direct institutional form, but many more times through their students and through their staff, were directly involved in the struggle against apartheid. In a lot of ways, there were many people here in our universities, students and staff, who actually gave up their lives for that struggle. There are many. Rick Turner, David Webster, and many, many other academics in this country who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle gave up their lives and paid the ultimate sacrifice for bringing an authoritarian system to an end. Countless others were actually imprisoned. Many in this room were imprisoned at one time or the other. And so, actually, our universities, our staff, our students have played a fundamental role and were counted when they needed to be counted. Some of them paid the ultimate cost, and ultimately, they played a significant role in bringing an end to an authoritarian system, perhaps one of the great successes of the latter part of the 20th century. And the universities played an instrumental role in that. But South African universities are not simply noted for that, actually. They're also noted for the fact that in the post-apartheid phase, these universities were immersed in policy processes, in research, in teaching, in active engagement to rebuild the society. And that's what's really fascinating about it. This is why South Africa is such a fantastic social laboratory, particularly for the issue of civic engagement. It's a particularly appropriate social laboratory because these universities have both been an implicit part of the project to destroy a system, and then they've been part of the project to recreate the system. And the objective of recreating that system was to create a system that was more humane, more equitable, and more equal. So South African universities, if you like, were active agents in the struggle for liberation and have been active agents in the struggle to reconstruct society. But as much as they have been all of that, what is also quite striking about the post-apartheid period is that their civic role and their civic engagement has in one sense been subverted. And in this sense, South African universities are a particularly appropriate case study to learn lessons from, to know and learn the lessons of success in breaking a system, to learn some of the successes in recreating a system, and to learn about some of the failures of our experiences, because that process of civic engagement was itself subverted. And I want to reflect on a if you like, a debate that took place 20 years ago between two individuals who were at that point at the university. I'm currently at the University of Witwatersrand. One of whom was here, Max Price, when he was still director of the Center for Health Policy at the University of Witwatersrand. And another colleague, Eddie Webster, who was then director of the Sociology of Work program. And this engagement took place in a journal called, in the pages of a journal called Transformation, I think about 2 or 3 years after the 1994 election. And really it was a reflection on the role of universities and academics in assisting the processes of reconstruction. And Max Price, who's here now as Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, bemoaned the fact that in engagements with the new government, university progressive academics who had long been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle were now expected to simply deliver a technical service, a technical consultancy service. And he worried about the dimensions and the implications of that. And he worried about the social impact of that. If we were simply treated as consultants to undertake a technical task, then you subvert the very essence of the role of the university's engagement. Eddie Webster recognized that challenge, and he worried about it. But he also said that the opportunities of the time were too great to have an impact. And he encouraged an engagement with these institutions because he suggested that if you miss this opportunity, you would miss the opportunity to have this kind of social impact. But what that conversation did is it brought to the fore very early on in our democratic phase the great possibilities of engagement, but also that the dangers of that engagement can become formal, they can become technical without the substantive purpose that that engagement is meant to generate. The new white paper on higher education that was adopted again 2 or 3 years, and Nassima Bacha was involved in that after 1994. And much of the post-apartheid discourse recognized the civic role and the importance of social impacts of the university. But they saw it as the third leg of the university's role. But I think when they did that, it had the unintended consequence of marginalizing civic engagement and civic activity as an auxiliary activity into the university, as the one that, very much like the way CSIs, corporate social investment, and corporate social responsibility is imagined in the corporate sector. The marginalization of the university's civic role was also consolidated by the political economy in which universities were located. The financial pressures of the post-apartheid era, when the university system doubled from about 421,000 students to something like just above 1 million over a period of 15, 16 years. And monies and resources had to be directed to what was an increasing, expanding system of teaching and research. And university vice-chancellors and bureaucrats like me began to deploy those resources in the places that needed to, or what they imagined that needed to be invested in. And in that context, civic engagement was effectively seen as an unfunded mandate and effectively became as a luxury unaffordable in the post-apartheid era. This was reinforced, as my colleague said, by the global ranking systems. The global ranking systems and the competitive dynamic that we all know exists between our universities. And again, those global ranking systems and the competitive dynamic that forces us to become responsive to those ranking systems has essentially prioritized teaching and research, and in the process, civic engagement and civic impact and social impact are issues that begin to be delegated to somebody else. This is not to suggest that nothing good has happened over the last 20 years. Universities have admirably risen to the challenges of their context. Almost all universities have programs that work with students from secondary education systems, marginalized students from the secondary education system. In my own university, we have something called the Targeting Talent Program, which takes essentially about 1,000 students every year from rural schools, puts them in a summer and a winter school, trains them in the kinds of subjects that they are being trained in, gives them an enormous amount of understanding about career options, etc., and allows them to progress through the secondary education system. Now, Wits is not unique in this, actually. I can tell you every single university in this country has a similar program underway in the either local townships, in a much more broader context, in the broader state or provincial networks. But every single institution in this country has a similar program. And that's something that's worth bearing. Many of our universities have volunteer programs for staff and students. And most of these programs are about tutorial assistance, homework assistance, reading clubs. Food insecurity has become a big issue. In my previous university, the University of Johannesburg, one of the most striking things was out of 50,000 students, we did a study that 3,500 students did not have a decent meal a day. And so we had to put a huge food insecurity program in place. And a similar kinds of initiatives already exist in virtually every university. There's much involvement in NGOs, and there's a significant amount of activity in social movements. Most of our universities are in one way or the other. Most of our legal aid clinics are involved in supporting individuals in marginalized communities in one form or the other. At the moment, there's the Marikana Commission taking place, which is an investigation into what was effectively the massacre of 36 mine workers in Marikana during a labor strike, a violent labor strike, I might add. And what has happened is since then, there's been a commission of inquiry into what had occurred on that day. And many of our universities, many of the people in our universities' legal clinics, in our legal departments, many of our students are involved in support networks for killed miners, their families, and even providing legal services to those families in the Marikana Commission. But despite all of these fantastic activities, it is hard to deny that these activities are external to the core business of the university. The core business of the university is still imagined as teaching and learning. And they really happen, these kind of fantastic activities happen not because of the university. They happen despite the university. And that's the essential challenge that confronts us at this moment. There really is an urgent need for us to rethink civic engagement, for us to rethink this third role that all of us claim is necessary for the effective functioning of the university. If our universities are to be relevant in this age, then it seems to me that we need to be both nationally responsive and we need to be globally competitive. But as I've said elsewhere, we cannot be truly world-class and globally competitive if we simply imitate the other. Because you'll always be the poor imitation of the other. If you truly want to be world-class, if you truly want to be globally competitive, you need to take your own context seriously. And you need to become responsive to that context. And you need to begin to address the challenges of that context. Second, how many times have you sat here and been in these engagements and heard Vice-Chancellors say that we are not simply intent on producing technicians and professionals of the 21st century, but we are truly focused on producing citizens for the 21st century. But how can you truly be responsive to your national context? How can you be truly responsive to creating the challenge of creating the 21st century citizen if civic engagement is not core to the agenda of the university? That's the fundamental challenge that is confronting us at this historical moment. And it seems to me that we are going to have to ensure, if we are going to ensure that civic engagement doesn't continue as the third phenomenon, as the CSI syndrome of our present, that it is in the present, then we need to start rethinking how civic engagement is conceptualized and how social impact is conceptualized in the university. We need to understand, as so many of you have said, how it becomes core to the teaching program, how it becomes core to the research program. But we also need to be clear that it has to be core to the architecture of the university itself. You can't speak about social engagement. You can't speak about civic engagement. You can't speak about social impact if your admissions processes are not addressed. You can't speak about social impact if the decision-making in your institutions do not simply continue to empower the privileged in the society. Empowering the disenfranchised, empowering the marginalized, has to be core to the very architecture. It has to be core to the very decision-making of the universities itself. It needs to impact on your admissions processes. It needs to impact on your assessment processes. It needs to impact on every single component of university life. Otherwise, civic engagement and social impact is the other thing you do when you've got some extra time. Or it's the other thing you do when one or other great individual goes through your ranks. That's the challenge of our time. Secondly, if we are going to be serious about ensuring that civic engagement is core to teaching and research, we need to learn from the examples that we do have. We do have many good university service learning modules in many disciplines that have internalized this practice, in the health sciences, in education, in some parts of engineering, in social work, and in speech and hearing. And we need to learn and interrogate these learning experiences from a pedagogical point of view in these disciplines. And we need to expand it to other disciplines. Our research must similarly be governed by social impact considerations and by our research methodologies that must be similarly informed by participatory processes where it is warranted and where it can enrich the collection of data and the analysis itself. That's the challenge that we have to ask ourselves. So I want to end here by posing 3 or 4 big questions for the deliberations. I recognize that there are already questions that have been posed by the organizing committee. But I do think that these 3 questions within those thematic focuses are core if we are going to make a progress as we go forward. 1, let's have the courage to ask the simple question. We have never spoken as much about civic engagement in universities as we have in the last 25 to 30 years. Yet our world is far more unequal in 2014 than it was in 1990 and it was in 1975. How is it the more we talk about civic engagement, how is it the more we build NGOs, that our world becomes directly opposite to what its intention is? Our world today is far more unequal. Every single indicator shows it. It's far more unequal, it's far more socially polarized than it's ever been. And yet, we speak about equity. Yet we speak about equitable outcomes. Yet we speak about impact. Yet we speak about marginalization in every single part of our planet. We've been talking about it for 20 years, and our world has gone in exactly the opposite direction. What is wrong in our conversations that it has so little impact? Let me ask you a second question. How do we win over colleagues who for decades have been taught to teach in a particular way, who for decades have been taught to research in a particular way? And how do we win them over to the project of making civic engagement and participation to the core of their teaching and to the core of their research enterprise? That's the second deliberation that has to happen. The third is, how do we do this in a way that does not significantly increase the financial burden on the poorest of communities? How do we make sure that it does not unnecessarily extend the learning process in a way that governments think are unsupportable? And how do we do it in a way that enhances the pedagogical project of learning itself? And finally, how do we ensure that we change the systemic pressures on bureaucrats like myself so that we are prompted to support and create an enabling environment within universities for civic engagement, action, and social impact? Because as Max did say earlier on, the incredible systemic pressures that actually prompt bureaucrats like me to prompt and create a disabling environment for civic action. How do we change the very systemic pressures on the bureaucracy of universities and systems so that they can create the formal choices and make the kinds of choices that would create an enabling environment for this thing? These questions are important because they're really central to creating political will for taking civic action seriously in universities and making it core to the university enterprise. Political will is necessary if we are keen to move from the realm of rhetoric to the realm of action. It's absolutely central. And your deliberations in the coming days are central to this project. They're central to imagining the university in all our societies in the 21st century. They're central to imagining what a society should look like in the 21st century. And they are central to imagining what a participatory and equitable global citizenry would look like in the 21st century. They are central to changing our world. And for that, I wish you the best in your collective deliberations. Thank you very, very much.